The wind at Portland International had picked up fast that morning, grounding my flight and rerouting my weekend plans entirely. I wasn't supposed to be home until Sunday. But standing on my porch, that Friday afternoon suitcase still in hand, I decided to turn the unexpected return into a quiet surprise. Brendan and Kayla had offered to house sit. They'd said it would be good for them a calm space while their kitchen was under renovation. I imagined them curled up on my couch, maybe a movie playing, maybe laughter. But as I stepped up to the front door and reached for my spare key, I heard voices. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but what I heard through that crack in the kitchen window made my chest tighten and my breath stop. My son's wife said calmly, almost sweetly, "I've already started putting the drops in her drinks." The sky was heavy when I landed back in Oregon, the air thick with that sticky kind of summer rain. My return was unplanned. The airline had cancelled my connection, and I didn't feel like spending the night at the airport hotel. So I caught the earliest flight and took a cab straight home. I was even a little excited. It had been a long time since I surprised anyone. I imagined Brendan and Kayla relaxing, maybe cooking dinner together. I smiled at the thought as the cab pulled into the driveway. I didn't announce myself. I wanted to knock and watch their faces light up. But the closer I got to the door, the more something in my chest tugged me to slow down. The window above the sink was cracked open just slightly. A breeze pushed the lace curtain aside just enough for the voices to carry out. Kayla's voice floated clearly. She didn't sound angry. She sounded practical, like she was talking about a new recipe or a trip to the store. She said, "I've already started putting the drops in her drinks. That should start showing symptoms in about a week or so." Brendan didn't answer right away. I heard a long pause. Then, "Do we really need all that?" "She's forgetful already," Kayla replied. "It has to be documented, otherwise we can't get full guardianship." My hand clenched around the key in my coat pocket. My body felt rooted to the porch ice, spreading through my fingertips. Drops in my drinks. Guardianship. I stood there in the soft drizzle, staring at the door I had walked through 1,000 times. But that moment, it didn't feel like my home anymore. If you've ever come back to a place thinking it would comfort you, only to find it turned into something unrecognizable, you'll understand what I felt right then. I swallowed hard, forced a breath, and slowly straightened up. Then I opened the door, smiling, like I didn't hear a thing. And so the performance began. The moment I stepped inside, Kayla turned from the kitchen island with a startled smile. Brendan stood stiff near the fridge, his hand still resting on a half-closed cabinet. They hadn't expected me, that much was clear. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door, like I always did. Rolled my suitcase gently across the floor. Looked around and said in the most casual voice I could muster, "Flight got cancelled." Surprise. Kayla hurried over with open arms. Brendan muttered something about the weather. I leaned into Kayla's hug, and for the first time, I realized how strange it felt to hold someone who had just planned to undo your life. Her perfume was citrus and powder, clean, controlled. Dinner was already cooking, chicken in the oven, something boiling on the stove. She offered me a glass of warm milk, said it might help after the travel stress. I took it. The glass was smooth, just a little too warm in my hand. I raised it to my lips and let a small sip coat my tongue. It tasted faintly floral, not unpleasant, just off. I smiled again, carefully, like I always had around Brendan since he turned 16, and started looking at me with that hard distance in his eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. That's just what I needed." We sat down together, the three of us. Kayla asked polite questions. Brendan stayed quiet. I answered slowly, let my words hang a bit longer than usual. I dropped the name of my neighbor when I meant to say the cats. I paused mid-sentence twice, pretending to lose my train of thought. Their eyes flickered toward each other, quick, subtle. Later that night, I unpacked my suitcase, folded my things like nothing had changed. Then I sat in the living room, letting the house go quiet. Kayla came in with a small tray of cookies and tea. She said, "I'm glad you're back early. You should rest. Let us help around the house while you settle in." I nodded. "That's very kind of you." When she left, I placed the untouched cup on the mantel and sat back. This was not the house I had left behind, and I was not the woman they remembered. I stared out the window for a long time, not in fear, but in focus. Every performance has a beginning, and I had just taken my place on the stage. By morning, the house had settled into a rhythm that didn't feel like mine anymore. Brendan left early with a vague excuse about needing to check on something at the bank. Kayla stayed behind, all warmth and casual concern, hovering just enough to feel like supervision rather than kindness. I moved through the kitchen slowly, letting my steps drag my words slur slightly at the edges. I fumbled with the kettle. She offered to help. I declined, smiling. Once she stepped into the backyard to take a call, I moved quickly to the side cabinet near the pantry. I kept a few old things in there, things from when my husband and I still ran a business together. I slid the top drawer open and reached under the felt lining. My fingers found it easily. A small recorder, dusty but still working. I pocketed it and returned to the table. When Kayla walked back in, I asked if I had taken my blood pressure pills already. She smiled and said, "Yes, I had just half an hour ago." I nodded like I didn't quite remember, eyes drifting over to the window like I'd lost track of the day. Later that afternoon, I made a point of leaving my phone face up on the hallway table. I set a fake calendar alert to buzz in 20 minutes. I knew Kayla checked things. She had that kind of quiet control. The notification popped up right on time. Neurology consult, Dr. Edelson. She picked up my phone while I was out on the porch, watering plants, and placed it back exactly where I had left it. But the alert had cleared. I smiled to myself. At dinner, I told Brendan the cat had been hiding all day, even though we hadn't had a cat in over a year. He blinked, hesitated, and changed the subject. Kayla watched me closely, eyes narrowing slightly just for a second. I asked her to pass the salt, then called her Julia. I corrected myself a beat too late. She said nothing. That night, I slipped the recorder beneath the cushion of my armchair and left it running as I pretended to nod off in front of the TV. They thought I was asleep. I wasn't. Brendan whispered, "She's slipping. Did you hear her today?" Kayla said, "It's happening faster than I expected. The doctor will back us up if we get the paperwork ready." I let the words settle in my chest like sediment. Heavy, familiar, predictable. Later, I labeled a manila folder and tucked the recorder inside. I added a sticky note that read, "Day 1, taped it shut, hid it behind the books in my old office closet. In the morning, I made coffee and forgot to put in the filter. I called the garage the garden. I left the fridge open for 20 minutes. Kayla gently suggested I let her handle the groceries from now on. I nodded again, smiling. They were building their case. I was building mine. The performance was no longer just a mask. It had become my second skin. By the end of the week, I had developed a rhythm. I woke up early, shuffled around the kitchen just enough to seem forgetful, then retreated to the garden and spoke to the rose bushes like they were old friends. Brendan and Kayla seemed reassured by it all. They assumed I was fading quickly, and I let them. One morning, I heard Kayla talking on the phone in the sunroom. Her voice was low, but I caught a few words. She mentioned a document waiting for a physician's signature, something about capacity and pre-approval. I stood just out of sight and closed my eyes, willing myself to stay calm. Then I turned away, humming softly as I headed toward the kitchen to boil water I never planned to use. That afternoon, while Kayla was out and Brendan had dozed off in the recliner, I sat at the desk in my old sewing room. I opened the drawer where I kept coloured sticky notes and pulled out a small stack. On each one, I wrote short sentences. Some were real, like appointments and grocery lists. Others were thoughts I had overheard. Names, phrases, dates. I took a shoebox from the closet, lined it with envelopes, and began placing each sticky note inside its own sleeve. I labelled each envelope by day and sealed them neatly. In the bottom corner, I placed a backup USB drive holding the recordings. Taped beside it, the small recorder that had been running quietly every evening. All of it was going into the archive. That night after dinner, I let the silence stretch longer than usual. Kayla finally broke it by asking if I was feeling okay. I gave her a soft smile and said, "Sometimes I feel like the days all blend together now." She looked satisfied with that answer. Then she added gently that we should talk soon about simplifying some of my affairs, just so things wouldn't become too complicated later. Her tone was sugar-coated, but her eyes were sharp. I nodded, pretending not to grasp the weight of her words. I waited until midnight. In the still of the house, I crept back into the kitchen. I knew Brendan always left his laptop charging by the dining room outlet. I didn't touch it, but I took note of the login screen the insurance company's tab left open and a document labelled Guardianship Draft visible in the background. The next morning I fumbled while making toast, dropped the butter, forgot the coffee pot was already full. When Kayla handed me a smoothie she had made, I looked her straight in the eye and thanked her, then sipped it without hesitation. I had hidden the recorder under the base of the flower vase that sat on the table between us. I needed to capture more than just intentions. I needed the way she said things, the slight control in her tone, the way she directed the conversation, always leading it gently toward dependency. By the end of that day, I sat in my reading chair with the shoebox of sticky notes beside me and the evening light casting long shadows across the rug. My hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the energy of everything I was holding inside. The betrayal, the strategy, the long game. I tucked the box away beneath the cushion and leaned back, feigning fatigue. But my mind remained sharp, focused, and far from done. It was a quiet Sunday morning when I found Brendan sitting alone on the back porch, staring out across the yard with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. He didn't look up when I opened the sliding door. He just gave a slight nod, like he'd been waiting for me. I stepped outside, wrapped in my cardigan, and took the chair across from him. The air was crisp. A faint breeze rustled the leaves in the maple tree. I said nothing at first, just sat there with him, letting the silence stretch until it felt safe to speak. "Your father used to sit here every morning," I said gently. "He liked watching the birds more than the news." Brendan's jaw tightened just a little. He took a sip from his cup and stared straight ahead. "He always thought you'd take over the garden." I continued watching his expression shift. "Said you had the hands for it. Quiet strength, he called it." Brendan let out a sharp breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "He always had something to say about what I wasn't," he muttered. "Never what I was." I waited. Let him sit with that for a moment. Then I asked softly, "What do you think he missed?" Brendan turned toward me for the first time that morning. His eyes looked tired, worn in a way deeper than lack of sleep. He ran a hand through his hair and leaned back in the chair. "He didn't get me," he said. "Not really. He always thought you were the smart one, the organized one. I was the one who forgot appointments, lost things. When I dropped out of business school, he didn't even yell, just looked disappointed. That was worse. I felt the ache in those words. I knew the shape of that kind of wound. Quiet, lingering, never fully named. I never told him I said, but he worried about you more than anyone. He just didn't know how to say it. He thought if he pushed, maybe you'd prove him wrong, maybe you'd become what he couldn't be. Brendan looked away, his shoulders slumped. And when he died, you handled everything. The house, the funeral, the money. No one asked me to do a thing. I felt like a guest at my own father's service. The grief in his voice wasn't fresh, but it was deep, still raw in corners he hadn't visited in years. You were never a guest, I said. You were just grieving in a way none of us understood. And maybe you still are. He didn't answer, but I saw the shift in his body, something unspoken unraveling. I reached over, rested my hand on his. It's not too late to be something different. You're not bound to the shadows of how he saw you. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the trees. For a second, he looked like a boy again, lost and wanting. But even as I sat beside him, offering comfort, I knew this softness could be dangerous. Brendan's pain might explain his choices, but it didn't excuse them. He had chosen Kayla, chosen this plan. I stood, pressed a kiss to his temple, and walked inside. And behind the closed door of my bedroom, I wrote down every word he had said, every sentence that revealed his fear, his shame, his motive. Because understanding him didn't mean trusting him, and compassion was not the same as permission. It was just after 7 a.m. when I reached out to Sharon. I hadn't spoken to her in years, but her number was still saved in my little address book, the one with the frayed corners and the ink-stained cover. She picked up on the second ring. I kept my voice steady, calm. Sharon was someone who understood nuance, who could read between the lines. She'd worked with elder advocacy groups for decades. If anyone would believe me without needing me to spell everything out, it was her. By the end of the call, she had agreed to meet me at a quiet diner just outside town. I arrived early and chose a corner booth near the back. Sharon showed up in a navy pantsuit and low heels, her grey hair swept into a neat bun. She looked the same as she did when we were both in our 50s, composed, alert, impossible to fool. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. After ordering coffee, she leaned forward and said, "Tell me everything." I slid a folder across the table. Inside were photocopies of Brendan's emails to a financial advisor I hadn't authorized. The most recent one was just 2 days old. It mentioned revisiting guardianship options and strategic asset control. I handed over the flash drive next. It contained the audio clips I'd recorded so far. Kayla's voice was clear, smooth, matter-of-fact. Her words about getting paperwork started and a memory test scheduled with Dr. Patel chilled me more with each replay. Then came the container. I had rinsed out the last bit of milk from the carton Kayla had labelled smoothie base and poured it into a sterile lab vial I'd picked up at the pharmacy. I didn't know what exactly was in it, but Sharon assured me she'd have it tested discreetly. She sifted through the materials, brows furrowed, jaw set. When she looked up, her expression was grave. "Marion, you can't stay there much longer without official legal protection. If they're moving toward guardianship, even small slip-ups could be used against you. You're already ahead, but they won't hesitate to act fast if they feel cornered." I nodded slowly, feeling both validated and unsettled. I wasn't ready to leave just yet. There was more to do, more to uncover, more to confirm. I told her I had backup copies of every file hidden in places Brendan and Kayla would never think to check. I had also removed my medical proxy paperwork from the kitchen drawer and placed it in my bank's safe deposit box. Sharon placed her hand on mine, firm and warm. "You're doing the right thing, but you need to decide what your next move is before they make theirs." We parted with a quiet hug. She took the evidence with her. I walked back to my car, the autumn wind sharp on my cheeks. Later that evening, I sat on the edge of my bed and reread the note I'd written months ago. It was a simple list. bank contact, attorney name, asset file location, and one final sentence. If anything happens to me suddenly, none of this was an accident. That night, I tucked the note into an envelope and taped it beneath the wooden drawer of my nightstand, just in case. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen blinds, painting soft lines across the tile floor. I moved carefully, deliberately aware of every sound and shadow in the house. Brendan had already left for his meeting with the estate planner. Kayla was in the shower. It was the perfect window. I unlocked the drawer under the bookshelf in my study. Inside was a small black pouch that held the original trust documents I'd signed with my late husband 2 years before he passed. There was also a revised version dated 6 months ago, one that named a different financial executor and bypassed Brendan entirely. That version had been notarized quietly by a traveling notary Sharon had recommended, before Henry's health took a final turn. Next to it was the power of attorney document. Not the fake one I suspected Brendan was preparing to draft with his lawyer, but the real one I'd already filed with our credit union, giving authority to our longtime advisor, Cheryl Kim. Cheryl had worked with Henry for 20 years. She knew my intentions well. I took a breath and laid out the papers on the desk, cross-referencing everything. My fingers traced over Henry's signature, steady and confident, even in the months before his passing. His trust in me was inked into every page. I placed the documents into a sealed folder and tucked it into my tote bag, zipped up with a scarf draped over the top. I planned to meet Cheryl that afternoon to reconfirm the freeze we had put on all withdrawals over a certain amount. We had done that months ago, anticipating a potential family crisis. At the time, I had hoped we were just being cautious. Now I knew we were being wise. That afternoon, Cheryl greeted me with a quiet nod in the office's private meeting room. She reviewed the documents and confirmed everything remained secure. No changes had been made. Brendan's name was nowhere near the decision-making authority, just as I had planned. Before leaving, I handed Cheryl a USB drive containing audio clips and photographs. Not everything, just enough to show a pattern in case anything were to happen. Cheryl agreed to store it off-site, along with the latest notarized affidavit from Sharon outlining the timeline of events. By the time I returned home, the house felt still in a different way. Brendan's car was back. Kayla was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared dinner. I could smell garlic and rosemary comfort food, her specialty, when she wanted something. I played along. Later that evening, as we sat at the table, Brendan brought up the idea of consolidating some household accounts. He said it casually, as if it were a passing thought. I smiled gently and excused myself to wash the dishes. The cracks were forming now, barely visible, but widening. They didn't know yet that I had quietly shifted the center of gravity beneath their feet. In the hallway outside my bedroom, I passed the antique mirror Henry had restored years ago. I paused and looked at my reflection. My eyes were clear, not fogged by fear or confusion. Behind them was resolve. I was no longer just reacting, I was leading. Quietly, steadily, with every step forward planned. The documents were real, the authority was mine, and I wasn't done yet. By the time Thursday rolled around, I knew the performance needed to reach its peak. If they were going to believe I was declining, I had to make them feel the urgency, the kind that justified bold moves. That morning, I put on my thick cardigan backward, let my hair stay tangled, and walked into the living room holding a spatula in one hand and my purse in the other. Kayla glanced up from her laptop. I saw the flicker in her eyes. She tilted her head and said in that sickly sweet voice she reserved for her patients, not her mother-in-law, "Need help with something?" I blinked at her, looked at the spatula and said I was trying to find my toothbrush. Then I wandered out without another word. In the backyard, I watered the fake orchid Henry had bought me from a discount shop in Sedona. I spoke to it like it was an old friend. Then I stood there for 10 minutes, staring at the neighbor's fence as if I'd forgotten why I was outside. That night I forgot the soup was simmering on the stove. It burned. The smell filled the house. Brendan came down with a sharp tone, asking what was going on. I stood near the sink, distant, humming an off-key tune from my high school years. I said I thought the dog was barking. We hadn't owned a dog in 20 years. Brendan's frustration was growing. I saw it in the way he paced, the way he kept opening and closing the drawer where he kept the paperwork. And when Kayla found me staring at the family photo wall, tracing my finger along Brendan's baby picture, and whispering the wrong name, she quietly sent him a text, right there in the hallway. She didn't know I saw. They were ready. That weekend they brought me a smoothie, the same kind Kayla had been offering all month. I accepted it, took a sip, smiled. Then when they stepped out, I poured it into the houseplant and rinsed the glass. The audio recorder in my cardigan pocket clicked on as Brendan walked in later that afternoon. He started talking to Kayla about timing, about whether the doctor had responded. She said she'd follow up. She also said clearly, "She thinks I'm doing her a favor with those drinks." I filed that one carefully. That evening, I sat in front of the television pretending to look for a show I had watched just the night before. I laughed at the commercials like they were skits. Then I got up and opened the hall closet, searching for my high school yearbook that I claimed I needed to pack for a dentist appointment. Brendan said I should rest. I told him I was worried I'd forget my name if I didn't hold on to old memories. He sat down slowly, eyes on me. "Maybe we should get someone to help you, Mum, just until things settle." I nodded and said I trusted him. Then just before bedtime, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the door. I knew Brendan was listening outside. I began muttering names under my breath. Names of nurses from when Henry was sick. Then I called Kayla by one of them. I heard Brendan shift in the hallway. They believed it now. They were certain they were right. But they had no idea they were performing too, and I was the one directing the scene. Every line they spoke was recorded. Every smile I gave was practiced. Every lapse they witnessed was carefully staged. And I wasn't done yet. The curtain hadn't dropped. Not even close. It was a Tuesday morning when Brendan placed a manila folder on the kitchen table. He didn't say much, just that it was time we got some things in order. I was stirring oatmeal absent-mindedly, letting the wooden spoon scrape the bottom of the pot in a rhythm that had started to comfort me. The air was thick with silence. He tapped the folder twice, then slid it closer to me. I glanced down, but didn't open it. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood behind me as if waiting for a signature, not a conversation. I could feel the weight of it all pressing into the room, the unsaid truths, the falsified worries, the plans they believed I didn't see. I took the folder upstairs. My hands trembled slightly, just enough for him to notice. That was important. I sat on the bed, pretending to struggle with the tab. Once the door clicked shut behind me, I took a deep breath, pulled on my reading glasses, and opened the folder. Inside were several neatly clipped documents. The first was labeled Durable Power of Attorney. The next, a financial guardianship request. Both had highlighted sections where I was expected to sign. They were dated a few days ago, and Kayla's name appeared on the witness line of two of them. A sticky note in Brendan's handwriting said something like, "Get Mum's signature by this week, lawyer needs it for final filing." There was no hesitation left in me. I pulled out my phone, opened the secure recording app, and snapped photos of every page. Then I opened the nightstand drawer and pulled out a small brown envelope I'd tucked away 2 weeks earlier. I slid the documents inside, sealed it, and placed it under the lining of my old jewelry box, the one Brendan had always thought was empty since I stopped wearing rings after Henry passed. I called Sharon that afternoon from the pharmacy parking lot. I told her I had something that couldn't wait. We met in her office after hours. I handed her the envelope, and showed her the folder Brendan had given me. She read in silence, flipping pages, her jaw tightening with every new sheet. Then she looked at me with that familiar calm I remembered from our college years, before life turned us into shadows of ourselves. She told me carefully that if I had signed those papers, I would have been giving Brendan the ability to move all assets, lock medical decisions, even sell the house. It would have made me legally dependent. No court hearing, no appeal. I sat still, listening. The room suddenly felt cold, like every ounce of love I had poured into raising that boy had curdled into something I couldn't name. I handed her the backup drive with the recordings. She nodded and said she'd contact the state's Elder Protective Services the next morning. Then she pulled out a slim folder from her drawer labeled Emergency Contingency. She had already filled it in my name. She was ready too. That evening I returned home with a grocery bag in hand and a quiet face. Kayla asked if I was okay. I nodded. Brendan looked at me across the table and asked if I had looked at the paperwork. I told him I was thinking about it. I asked if I could hold on to it a few more days. He said sure. His voice was smooth, casual too. Too casual. That night I tucked the originals under my mattress and locked the door to my room. I laid awake for hours. Not because I was scared, because the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was how calmly they had prepared to erase me one form at a time. But I wasn't going anywhere. I hadn't fought this hard to disappear. And tomorrow they would begin to learn what it meant to cross a woman who hadn't forgotten who she was. At dawn, I packed the manila folder and a flash drive into my worn leather tote and drove straight to Sharon's office. She was waiting, a thermos of black coffee in one hand, her eyes sharp and steady. Her office felt warmer than usual, the kind of warmth that signals you're no longer alone in the fight. She didn't waste time. The moment I handed over the drive with the recordings and photos, she pulled up the State Elder Protection portal and began a formal submission. She clicked through the screens with quiet urgency. Audio files, transcripts, scanned paperwork. All of it uploaded under the classification of suspected financial coercion and undue influence. She printed out the confirmation receipt, handed me a copy, and placed the rest in a secure envelope marked for the oversight board. Her fingers tapped the envelope like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Then she looked at me and said we needed to make one more move. I nodded. We were ready. I called Mr. Kavanaugh, my financial advisor for over a decade, and asked to meet in person. He cleared his schedule that morning. I drove across town to his modest office above a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon. We sat across from each other in the quiet. I told him it was time to activate the secondary account and finalize the beneficiary shift we had discussed months ago. No more delays. He didn't ask why. He simply nodded, pulled up the secure forms, and walked me through the final steps. I transferred full control of my estate into a revocable trust managed solely by Kavanaugh and an outside legal trustee with no power of adjustment held by Brendan or Kayla. I asked him to begin the reallocation process immediately, moving accounts, updating property rights, revising healthcare proxies. It was all signed and notarized by noon. Meanwhile, Sharon had drafted a formal cease and desist warning. It would be sent to Brendan and Kayla via courier. Inside was a brief but firm statement. The household was now being monitored by state oversight, and any continued pursuit of guardianship could be interpreted as legal harassment. Before I left her office, Sharon handed me a sealed white envelope. Her eyes lingered on mine for a second longer than usual. This, she said, was our final layer. Later that evening, I placed that envelope on the mantel in plain view. It looked ordinary, unremarkable. But if Brendan or Kayla ever opened it, they'd find a notarized affidavit listing every suspicious event over the past 3 months, backed by timestamps, recordings, and signatures. It wasn't just a document. It was a boundary. And it was my warning without a single word spoken aloud. I kept up the act for 2 more days. I shuffled slowly around the kitchen. Let Kayla guide me to the table like a nursemaid. I even let Brendan remind me of my own bank pins, pretending to forget. But I watched. I listened. And I waited. On the third night, I heard Kayla on the phone whispering again in the laundry room. I stepped closer to the hallway, silent in my socks. She was telling someone about expedited processing. I caught fragments. Something about Brendan needing me to be cooperative within the week. Her voice lowered when she said we've already sent the documents. The rest depends on how confused she seems. My breath caught. But I didn't cry. I walked back to my room, shut the door gently, and opened my laptop. In the draft folder sat a press release Sharon's daughter had prepared. She was a journalist for a mid-tier investigative magazine. If I hit send, it would go live in 48 hours. Names, patterns, national statistics on guardianship fraud. With my story woven right through it. I didn't send it. Not yet. Because tomorrow I would see what they did once the envelope was opened. The warnings made real and the walls began to close in. The time for silence had ended. I just wanted them to hear the first crack themselves. From inside the house. I was in the garden that morning, pretending not to notice how Brendan had started watching me more closely, how Kayla stood near every doorway, a little too long. There was a quiet tension in the house, the kind that curls at the edges of a smile. I could feel it in my bones. The sealed envelope on the mantel had vanished. Someone had opened it. Someone had read it. That night, while folding towels in the laundry room, I heard a sharp rustling in the living room. A whisper, then louder, Kayla's voice rising, breaking its usual calm. She stormed in first, holding the envelope torn, and crumpled her hand, trembling not from fear but rage. Brendan followed slower, his face pale and unreadable. "You think you're clever," she said. Her voice tight, like piano wire. "You think this is going to scare us off?" I didn't answer. She turned to Brendan, waiting for him to speak. But he didn't. His hands were in his pockets, shoulders curled in like a boy being scolded. I saw the flicker in his eyes, the recognition that things had shifted, that whatever plan they had built now stood on glass. She stepped forward, waving the papers. "All of this, the recordings, the witnesses, the trustee paperwork? It doesn't matter. You can't undo what we started." Still, I said nothing. And then Brendan looked at me. Really looked. Eyes narrowed, like he had just begun to see, not the mother who tucked him in at night, but a stranger he couldn't control. The silence stretched until it hurt. Then he said it. Quiet, but it cracked something open. "You were never going to give it to us. Not the house, not the money. You always planned to cut us out." I stepped closer, slow and steady. "No," I said. "I never planned to cut you out. I just stopped pretending you were the kind of people I could trust with what mattered most." Kayla scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You want to die a martyr?" Fine. But Brendan's face shifted. Something softened. He glanced at Kayla, then at me, as if searching for a version of himself that still fit in this room. I walked to the mantel, lifted a framed photo of us from 10 years ago. My thumb brushed the glass. "I never forgot you," I said. "But somewhere along the way, I think I forgot myself." Kayla turned and walked out. Brendan stayed behind. He didn't speak again, just stood there as if the air itself had gone too heavy to hold. That night the house went quiet, the kind of quiet that stays, the kind you don't fill again. A week after Brendan and Kayla left the house, settled into a kind of quiet I had forgotten existed. Not the tense silence of pretending, but the peaceful hush of nothing left to hide. I sat on the front porch that afternoon, a blanket around my shoulders. the sun low and golden through the oaks. A breeze carried the scent of rosemary from the garden, and for the first time in months, I let myself exhale fully. I wasn't waiting anymore. Brendan hadn't left a note. No apology, just an emptied closet and a front door that didn't close quite right behind him. Kayla had taken most of her things too. The photos on the walls remained, but their frames now felt like evidence, not memories. A silver SUV pulled into the driveway. 3 young women stepped out, holding clipboards and canvas tote bags. Their jackets had the crest of the University Medical Center. I stood smoothing my cardigan and met them halfway. They had come on behalf of a new outreach program, the first initiative launched through the Ellsworth Fund for Elder Justice. My late husband's name now tied to something that mattered. The young woman with dark curls handed me a folder. She thanked me for helping fund their first round of training sessions, for making room in the world for stories like mine. She didn't know the whole story, but she knew enough. I walked them through the garden, showed them where the irrigation needed repair, where the porch light flickered. We laughed. They asked for stories, and I gave them 1 or 2. Just enough. Later, as the sun dipped lower, I sat back in the rocking chair. A gentle quiet settled over me. Not loneliness, not regret, just space. Brendan would not inherit the estate. That choice had been made long before he realized it. I had transferred everything house savings investments into the fund 6 months prior. Quietly, legally, intentionally. He had always thought he was playing a game of strategy, but I had stopped playing long ago. Now my story had a new home. Not in courtrooms or newspaper headlines, but in the hands of the next generation, in whispered warnings, in stronger women with clearer eyes. If you've ever felt pushed aside unheard or betrayed by the ones closest to you, I hope Marian's quiet strength spoke to something deep inside you. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a bang. It comes with a whisper, a boundary drawn, a legacy redefined. If this story moved you or reminded you of someone you know, feel free to share your thoughts. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And somewhere another woman is listening, waiting for the courage to begin her own.